Good evening. Tonight we step into the rough, ambiguous, and decidedly unglamorous corridors of history. Behind the glittering courts and celebrated naval victories lurked a much harsher condition, one that reeked of honeyed smoke and slow corruption. To inhabit that world truthfully was draining. It was a war not waged on open ground, but inside the skull. So before you settle in, pause for a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here, and share in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It never stops being intriguing to see who is joining us from across the globe. Silence your notifications, take a steadying breath, and let's begin. Before it bore a title, it was merely a bloom, a fragile wild thing forcing its way through the rocky earth of the Mediterranean shore. Its petals were a crinkled whisper of white, or blush pink, or a deep, bruised violet. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy. A name it would justify countless times over. Long before there were mighty states to cripple, there were only small, scattered human bands. Their knuckles still raw from the first stone axes, their thoughts only just beginning to weave together the intricate fabric of settled farming. Sometime around the 6th millennium BCE, in the soft soil of the Fertile Crescent, these Neolithic cultivators, our remote, exhausted forebears, took notice of this particular flower. Perhaps they observed how animals gnawed on the unripe seed pods and then grew docile, their terror of predators and hunger dissolving into a heavy, unconcerned calm. Or maybe it was a curious child hunting for something to chew who split open a green capsule and tasted the bitter, milky sap seeping from the cut. However it unfolded, the moment was a quiet revolution. They learned how to raise this plant intentionally, selecting the stalks that bore the fattest pods, the pods that cried the strongest, most potent tears. They perfected the simple, graceful craft of collecting it. Once the shimmering petals fell away, leaving behind a swollen blue-green globe crowned like a miniature king, they waited for just the right instant, on the edge of ripeness. Then, with a shard of sharpened flint or a finely honed bone blade, they scored the skin with a series of shallow, exact incisions. Almost at once, a thick white latex began to seep out, forming pearly beads on the surface. Exposed to air, it slowly reacted and darkened, turning into a sticky, brownish-black resin. This was the primal substance of dreams. This was opium. They scraped it off, rolled it into pellets or flat cakes, and put it away. A treasure dearer than any polished gem. Archaeological excavations in the lake dwellings of Neolithic Switzerland have yielded thousands upon thousands of poppy seeds, the remnants of a Stone Age indulgence, hinting that this plant was not merely recognized, but deliberately and widely cultivated. It was a staple. From these modest farming origins, the poppy began its relentless advance toward the center of civilization. In the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians, the very pioneers of writing itself, grew this flower with a devotion bordering on cultic reverence. On their clay cuneiform tablets, scratched around 3400 BCE, they christened it with a name that still rings with naive astonishment: Hulgil, the plant of joy. To them, it was a divine present, a direct conduit to the realm of the gods. Priests administered it during sacred observances, as a curling incense to carry invocations upward, or as a draught to open the inner ear to divine murmurs. It was a means of calming the existential terror of a people who lived at the mercy of flood-swollen rivers and temperamental deities. It eased the agony of childbirth, softened the death-rattle cough, and gave a fleeting but exquisite reprieve from the brutalities of Bronze Age existence. The plant of joy was interwoven with the very structure of their society, a holy medicine and a sanctified offering. The knowledge, like the great rivers themselves, flowed down to Egypt. The learned healers of the New Kingdom, whose collective expertise was gathered into the sprawling Ebers papyrus around 1550 BCE, knew the poppy well. They prescribed opium with a clear, methodical precision. It was a central ingredient in treatments for ailments of the eye. in mixtures to bind the bowels, and in one chillingly practical formula intended to stop a child's incessant crying. Picture a mother in ancient Thebes, her infant shrieking with colic or in the torments of teething. She measures out a tiny dose of this powerful concoction and administers it, and with it comes a blessed, unnatural quiet descending over her house. The city of Thebes itself soon became a major center of poppy cultivation. Its fields, collectively known as the Thebais, produced a particularly fine opium that moved along trade routes to distant lands. Packed carefully into amphorae, it was loaded onto Phoenician ships and carried across the glittering waters of the Mediterranean. It was far more than mere merchandise. It was an extension of Egyptian reach, a form of soft power that could numb a monarch's aching jaw or grant a sleepless nobleman a guaranteed night of rest. The poppy found an especially eager sanctuary among the cultures of the Aegean. On the island of Crete, the vivid Minoan civilization flourishing 2 millennia before Christ appears to have placed the poppy at the center of its spiritual universe. Archaeologists working there uncovered a small terracotta figure. Whether goddess or priestess we cannot say. Her eyes are wide and unblinking, her hands lifted in benediction. And thrust through her crown like divine antennae are 3 opium capsules, their notched discs unmistakable. She is the poppy goddess, a patroness of sleep, of visions, of the soft transition from this world into the next. The poppy here was not just a plant, it was the embodied sacred feminine, a font of healing and oblivion. On the Greek mainland, the poppy's reputation became more conflicted, a substance both exalted and distrusted. Homer, the legendary blind bard, speaks in the Odyssey of a strange drug called nepenthe, offered by Helen of Troy to a grief-stricken Telemachus. It is a potion that drives away all pain and sorrow and makes one forget every misfortune. Scholars have argued for generations over nepenthe's identity, but most now suspect that Homer was describing a wine infused with opium, a cup, that allowed the traumas of battle and the anguish of bereavement to simply dissolve. Later, the very father of medicine, Hippocrates, dealt with opium not as sorcery, but as pharmacology. Writing in the 4th century BCE, he brushed aside the magical beliefs that clung to the plant and instead catalogued its practical uses as a hypnotic, a narcotic, and a styptic. He recommended it for internal diseases and for uterine disorders, clearly recognizing its enormous therapeutic power. Yet even as Hippocrates sought to tame opium with reason and measurement, the older aura of mystery persisted. It was almost certainly employed in the secret Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred rites of initiation in the Greek world, where initiates sought an ecstatic, transformative encounter with the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. The initiates consumed a ritual drink known as kykeon. Though its full recipe has vanished with time, many now believe that a modest dose of opium formed its essential core, helping summon the intense visions and spiritual insights that these ceremonies were famed for. The Greeks grasped opium's inner contradiction. In a healer's hands, it could be a finely tuned instrument. In a priest's cup, it was a key to other realms. When Rome conquered Greece, it absorbed more than just land. It inherited its deities, its philosophies, and its pharmacopoeia. The Romans, with their gift for systems and supply chains, expanded the cultivation and commerce of opium to an entirely new magnitude. No longer was it a rare import or a closely guarded temple secret. Opium became part of the Roman everyday. The eminent physician Galen of Pergamon, who served Roman emperors in the 2nd century AD, wrote about opium more thoroughly than any predecessor. He hailed it as the mightiest of pain relievers. He recommended it as an antidote to toxins and venomous bites, for headaches, vertigo, partial deafness, epilepsy, apoplexy, dimness of sight, loss of voice, the list stretched on. He refined elaborate medicinal compounds known as theriacs, quasi-mythic cure-alls with opium as the indispensable active heart. These mixtures were sold in pharmacies throughout the empire. From senatorial mansions to soldiers' barracks, citizens bought opium mixtures to soothe pain, secure sleep, or simply escape the din and filth of crowded urban life. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor of Stoic fame, took a small dose nightly to ease the chronic aches that haunted him. Under Roman administration, the plant of joy underwent its first major metamorphosis. From sacred blossom to professional remedy to an ordinary commodity of daily comfort, a solace for the many, a habit for the elite, and an enterprise for the imperial economy. But its story was far from over. With the slow, convulsive fall of the Western Roman Empire, the great libraries of classical learning were scattered, burned, or abandoned. The intricate insights of physicians like Galen faded into a kind of spectral half-memory in Europe, preserved only in a few remote monasteries. The complex trade routes that had once carried premium opium from Egypt and Asia Minor disintegrated. Western medicine slipped into a long stagnation. Yet the ember of knowledge was not snuffed out. It was simply borne eastward to a luminous new civilization rising from Arabian sands. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly from the 8th to the 14th century, became the safeguard of the ancient world's learning. In Baghdad's splendid House of Wisdom, a great enterprise of translation unfolded. Arab, Persian, and Syriac scholars labored tirelessly, rendering the Greek works of Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen into Arabic and saving them from oblivion. But they did more than preserve. They questioned, refined, and extended this legacy in ways the Greeks and Romans could scarcely have anticipated. Muslim physicians, equipped with an advanced grasp of chemistry and botany, subjected opium to a new level of rigorous study. They became masters of pharmacology. The Persian polymath al-Kindi authored treatises detailing exact dosages required for pain relief. The brilliant clinician Razis, chief physician at Baghdad's Grand Hospital, pioneered the use of opium as an anesthetic, developing sponges soaked in a blend of opium, henbane, and mandrake. Patients inhaled the vapors and drifted into a deep, quiet sleep, allowing surgeons to undertake procedures that would have been unimaginable with a conscious, screaming patient. It was a revolutionary leap in the chronicle of medicine. Yet above all towered one figure whose influence would shape medicine for 6 centuries, the Persian scholar Ibn Sina, known in Latin as Avicenna. His monumental canon of medicine, completed around 1025, was a breathtaking consolidation of all known medical wisdom. Within its pages, Avicenna offered the most elaborate and perceptive evaluation of opium then in existence. He carefully recorded its virtues, recommending it for the relief of pain, for diarrhea, and for persistent coughs, and he recognized its particular usefulness in treating meningitis. He praised its therapeutic potency, calling it the most powerful of all sleep-inducing agents. But Avicenna was no mere enthusiast. He was a clear-eyed empiricist. He was among the first to systematically chart opium's darker face. He warned with unmistakable starkness of its capacity to cause lethargy, to cloud the intellect, to slow the breath, and to kill through overdose. Most prophetically, he identified and described its tendency to generate dependency, the fierce, gnawing desire it could kindle in those who used it imprudently. His canon was a model of balanced observation, uniting empirical caution with therapeutic boldness. It became the standard medical reference not only throughout the Islamic world, but once rendered back into Latin, in the universities of medieval Europe as well. While scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba were perfecting the science of opium, Arab merchants, the unrivaled masters of long-distance caravans, were spreading the drug itself. Opium pressed into dark, compact cakes became prized freight along the fabled Silk Road. Imagine the rhythmic sway of a camel column, bells chiming faintly in the vast hush of the Central Asian steppe. In their packs, beside bolts of shimmering silk, sacks of aromatic spices, and coffers of glittering glassware, lay these bricks of dried poppy juice. They traveled out of the Levant and Persia, through perilous mountain passes and scorching deserts, pausing at bustling caravanserais in Samarkand and Bukhara. The Silk Road carried more than commodities. It was a lifeline for culture, belief, and pharmacology. Along this path, opium embarked on the next great stage of its odyssey toward India. In the warm, abundantly watered landscapes of the Indian subcontinent, the poppy discovered a new homeland. The climate suited it perfectly, and soon immense tracts of white and purple blossoms glowed under the Indian sun. Opium easily folded into the long-standing traditions of Ayurvedic medicine, but it also insinuated itself into the life of the Mughal Empire, which began its ascent in the 16th century. The Mughal emperors and their courtiers adopted opium as more than a remedy. It became an elevated indulgence, a tool of contemplation and refined pleasure. They did not burn it in pipes. Instead, they drank it in a brew called doda, or ground it into an extremely fine powder and consumed it. For the ruling elite, it was a way to heighten poetic insight, to endure the stifling monotony of elaborate court rituals, or simply to drift into a calm, aloof detachment. Akbar the Great regulated its sale through state-licensed outlets, while his son Jahangir became notorious as a nearly incapacitated addict. Under Mughal patronage, India evolved into a major center of opium cultivation, rivaling the historic production zones of Anatolia and Egypt. The supply now swelled to enormous proportions, the quality was consistently high, and its influence was poised to reach still farther east to the harbors of the world's largest and proudest empire. Arab and, later, Portuguese seafarers plying the maritime trade lanes were the first to introduce opium to the ports of Qing China. For generations, it remained a foreign oddity, an exotic and extravagantly costly medicine imported in minuscule amounts. It was known as yapian or afuyong, phonetic echoes of foreign words. Chinese medical texts from the Tang and Song periods mention it as a treatment for dysentery and certain other disorders, a potent yet rare addition to the doctor's toolkit. The Chinese, like the Mughals, usually ate it, often blended with honey or dissolved in wine. In that form, its action was slow, the pleasure muted. Dependency was possible, but it crept up gradually and with less compulsion. For the educated Ming and early Qing upper classes, opium remained an occasional luxury, a symbol of status, a powerful sleep draft for an overworked scholar or aging official. In a vast, largely self-sufficient empire, it was a marginal substance. It posed no obvious danger. No one could have foreseen the chemical and cultural chain reaction that was about to erupt. A reaction that would convert this healer's panacea into a social toxin of staggering destructive power. The trigger would not arise in China itself, but from far across the oceans, in the newly encountered Americas. It came in the form of tobacco. The arrival of tobacco in China, carried by Spanish and Portuguese sailors in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, ignited what can only be called a national infatuation. The Chinese took up smoking with a zeal that astonished foreign onlookers. The habit raced from southern coastal towns all the way to the imperial court in Beijing. Alarmed by this unfamiliar vice and its rumored harms, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, issued an edict in 1639 forbidding both the sale and consumption of tobacco. It was a textbook case of well-meaning prohibition, and like so many that would follow in history, it failed spectacularly. Demand did not vanish, it merely slipped underground. In the shadows, that demand sparked a dangerous innovation. Smugglers and merchants, trying to camouflage their contraband or stretch their inventory, began blending tobacco with other substances. They experimented with arsenic and hemp. But the mixture that proved most irresistible, most powerful, and most profitable combined tobacco with opium. This new product was known as madak. It marked the critical turning point. The transition from swallowing opium to smoking it changed everything. When opium is eaten, the digestive tract and liver slowly process it. Only a portion of its active alkaloids reaches the brain over an extended period. But when the drug is smoked, the vapors are absorbed almost instantly through the vast surface area of the lungs, rushing straight into the bloodstream. The alkaloids bypass the liver's metabolic filter and cross the blood-brain barrier in seconds. The result is a sudden, overwhelming surge of euphoria, far more intense and compelling than anything produced by oral consumption. This mode of use maximized opium's addictive force, forging a neurological cage that was agonizingly hard to escape. Madak spread quickly, and official attempts to stamp it out proved helpless. The practice radiated inward from the coastal province of Fujian and from the island of Formosa, modern Taiwan, following rivers and trade routes deep into the empire's interior. By the early 18th century, users had refined the technique. Tobacco, once considered necessary, increasingly seemed superfluous. Devotees discovered that if they treated raw opium, boiling it, skimming off impurities, and reducing it to a thick, tarry concentrate called chandu, they could smoke the opium on its own. This demanded entirely new rituals and tools. The simple tobacco pipe was replaced with a specialized apparatus, a long stem, often crafted from bamboo or ivory, with a ceramic or earthenware bowl fixed to its side. The user did not simply ignite a lump of opium. Instead, a minuscule pellet of shandu was picked up on the end of a slender metal needle, heated over the flame of a dedicated lamp until it bubbled and puffed up, then deftly slid into the tiny aperture in the pipe bowl. The smoker would recline on one side, hold the bowl above the steady lamp flame, and draw the thick, sweet-scented vapor in deep, languid breaths. This intricate, almost ceremonial process gave birth to a new social setting, the opium house. These were not yet the filthy, chaotic dens of later Western imagination. In the 18th century, they were often tranquil, low-voiced, almost contemplative spaces. Patrons lounged together on raised platforms, their heads supported on porcelain or carved wooden pillows. The only constant noises were the soft bubbling from the pipes and the gentle hiss of the oil lamps. Within those walls, time appeared to unwind and slow. Conversations took on a muted, philosophical tone. Anxieties about harvests, debts, family duties, all seemed to dissolve into the perfumed fog. For a handful of hours, a person could drift outside themselves and become a spectator to their own life, wrapped in deep satisfaction and hazy indifference. It was an escape, and it was overwhelmingly enticing. What had begun as a pastime of seamen and dock workers in the southern ports began climbing the social ladder. Soldiers smoked to ward off boredom and fear. Merchants and officials used opium to lubricate dealings and bureaucratic negotiations, striking bargains in the soft stillness of the den. Scholars and poets turned to it for inspiration, finding that it loosened their thinking from the strict formalism of classical style. By the mid-18th century, the crisis had grown too conspicuous for the Qing government to overlook. Dependence on the drug, once mostly confined to the wealthy, had become a visible epidemic, cutting across every social layer. It drained the drive of promising scholars, emptied the coffers of affluent merchant clans, and rotted the integrity of the officials charged with enforcing the laws. The languor it produced was seen as a direct affront to Confucian virtues. Diligence, filial duty, and civic responsibility, the essential pillars of the Qing state. Emperor Yongzheng, a severe, conscientious ruler, was the first to fully grasp the magnitude of the danger. In 1729, he issued the first imperial decree aimed specifically at opium, prohibiting its recreational sale and banning the operation of opium houses. The penalties were harsh: strangulation for sellers and the kangwei, a heavy wooden punishment collar for users. Yet laws, however ferocious, were blunt tools against a pleasure so tightly tied to profit and corruption. The trade was simply too lucrative. Local magistrates and minor officials, poorly paid by the imperial treasury, discovered that accepting bribes or actively assisting smugglers was a much easier path to wealth. The edict drove the business deeper underground, spawning a sprawling, highly organized black market. Smugglers operated fast, shallow draft boats known as fast crabs, and scrambling dragons, able to outrun customs junks along the coastline. Opium was concealed within legitimate cargoes, and a web of secret societies and bought-off officials ensured its spread throughout the realm. Demand seemed bottomless, and for the moment, most of the supply was domestically produced, with a steady but manageable trickle arriving from India. China now harbored a festering internal wound, an addiction crisis that was slowly paralyzing its people. But that wound was about to be ripped wide open. On the horizon, a new kind of merchant fleet was appearing, the British East India Company's ships. And they were bringing opium not by the chest, but by the shipload. The slow, creeping malady was about to turn into a roaring, foreign-fueled epidemic. The root of the crisis was silver, a problem elegant in its simplicity and ruinous in its implications. For decades, the British Empire, especially its most powerful corporate organ, the British East India Company, had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese products. Above all, for tea, endless chests of it, packed into the holds of vessels, crossing the stormy seas around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. But also for silk so fine it felt like captured wind, and porcelain so delicate it seemed fired in a dragon's breath. London, and indeed all of Europe, clamored for these imports. The Qing dynasty, serene and self-contained in its ancient rhythms, wanted almost nothing from Britain in return. It had no use for heavy woolens or crude metalwares. At that point in history, China's workshops were the planet's manufacturing heart. Thus, for every chest of tea that arrived at the Thames, an equivalent fortune in silver had to be shipped out to Canton. The outflow was enormous, a hemorrhage of precious metal that threatened Britain's financial stability. A fix was required, not through diplomacy, but through commerce. A new export, something the Chinese did not yet realize they desired, but would soon find almost impossible to give up. And in the rich alluvial lands of Bengal, under the hazy Indian sun, that solution was already in bloom. Poppies stretching over field after field. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company ceased to be a simple trading house and effectively became a territorial government, the de facto ruler of Bengal. With that political control came mastery of the region's prime farmland, ideal for raising Papaver somniferum. The company, a marvel of bureaucratic and logistical machinery, created a total monopoly. This was not a free market. It was a centrally administered economy revolving around a single narcotic cash crop. Two main agencies, one based in Patna and the other in Benares, supervised the entire operation. Company agents advanced cash to local peasants, binding them to contracts that forced them to plant poppies instead of food crops. It was a quiet form of debt bondage. Once drawn in, few could ever truly escape. At harvest, farmers scraped the thick opium latex from the scored pods and delivered it to the company's factories. There it was purified, tested for strength, and pressed into dense, cannonball-sized cakes of about 3 pounds each. These cakes were then meticulously packed, cushioned with dried poppy petals, into sturdy wooden chests, each chest holding 40 cakes. This became a standard unit of exchange in world commerce. The final product was a high-grade, consistent and extremely potent opium known as Patna or Malwa brand, as recognizable in the smoky rooms of Canton as any English tea label in the parlours of Bath. The company, ever alert to its public reputation and its royal charter, maintained a careful fiction. Officially, it did not sell opium to China. That would have been unseemly and specifically forbidden under Chinese law. Instead, it organized grand auctions in Calcutta. The scene at these auctions was one of outward respectability. Men in fine coats bid on thousands of chests, the air heavy with cigar smoke and the scent of money. The auctioneer's steady chant tracked the transfer of staggering quantities of processed narcotic. The buyers were not company officials, but country traders, private British, American and Parsi merchants who owned fleets of swift clipper ships. Figures like William Jardine and James Matheson purchased their opium on credit, loaded the chests aboard their sleek vessels, and headed for the Chinese coast. They served as the deniable intermediaries, the unofficial distribution arm of the company's industrial-scale production engine. The East India Company could claim, with a straight face, that it merely manufactured opium and sold it at the warehouse gate. What transpired afterward, in foreign waters, was no longer its responsibility, or so the fiction went. With the silver earned from these auctions, the company in turn bought tea in Canton, completing a perfectly closed circuit. Silver no longer poured out of London into China. It now flowed out of China into the pockets of the country traders, who then used it to buy tea that the company sold in Britain at a profit. It was an elegant, self-reinforcing triangle of trade, devastating in its human consequences. The corporate engine thrummed at full capacity. Its fuel was addiction. For the Daoguang Emperor, ruling from the vast, hushed courtyards of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the reports arriving from the south read like a litany of rot. The crisis was no longer merely fiscal, though the reversal of the silver flow was now draining the imperial treasury and undermining the value of the currency. It had become a moral catastrophe, a spiritual ailment that was hollowing out his realm from within. From the humblest peasant to the loftiest court official, even among the elite Manchu bannermen who formed the backbone of the imperial army, the opium pipe was becoming sovereign. Productivity slumped, the social weave frayed. Imperial edicts prohibiting the drug had been proclaimed for decades, but they were effectively toothless, easily undercut by a network of corrupt local functionaries in Canton who grew fat on foreign bribes. Within the palace, the emperor and his advisors argued endlessly. Some favored legalizing and taxing the trade, a pragmatic scheme to regulate the vice and at least profit from it. Others, a faction of hardline moralists, insisted on total destruction of the traffic. The very soul of the nation, they maintained, was at stake. In 1838, the Daoguang Emperor chose his path. He sided with the hardliners and summoned a man whose reputation for intellect, efficiency, and incorruptible virtue was legendary across the empire. His name was Lin Zexu. Lin was a veteran administrator and a scholar of unimpeachable standing, a living embodiment of Confucian righteousness in an increasingly compromised age. The emperor appointed him Imperial High Commissioner, bestowing on him extraordinary authority to travel to Canton and eradicate the opium trade by whatever means he deemed necessary. When Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in early 1839, the foreign merchants quickly realized he was not like the pliable officials they were used to. He was uninterested in bribes, unmoved by flattery, and immune to their usual stalling tactics. He saw himself as a man on a sacred mission. His first blows were not directed at the foreigners, but at his own people. He arrested more than 1,600 Chinese sellers and users, dismantling the local distribution networks. He set up clinics for those stricken by addiction. He launched a sweeping public education campaign, plastering walls with proclamations explaining the drug's evils in vivid moralistic detail. He even composed a lengthy, eloquent letter to Queen Victoria herself, an appeal from sovereign to sovereign. "Where is your conscience?" he asked her. "Suppose," he wrote, "that men from another land carried opium into Britain and lured your own subjects into buying and smoking it. You, as the ruler of your honorable nation, would surely forbid its production and sale, and seize and destroy it if it appeared." His petition, of course, never reached her. It disappeared somewhere in the bureaucratic channels of London, disregarded or simply lost. Having scoured his own side of the street, Lin turned to the foreign traders clustered in their compact waterfront enclave, known as the 13 Factories. He proceeded with relentless method. First, he demanded that they surrender every chest of opium in their possession, not only those stacked in ships anchored in the harbor, but also the vast stores kept in floating depots at Linton Island in the Pearl River Delta. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, a weary and internally divided naval officer, offered to hand over about 1,000 chests as a compromise. Lin dismissed this token gesture with contempt. He was not bargaining, he was issuing an ultimatum. When the traders refused to comply fully, Lin acted with calm, deliberate force. He encircled the 13 factories with imperial troops. He blocked the river. He ordered all Chinese laborers, servants, cooks, and boatmen out of the compound, cutting off supplies of food and fresh water. The few hundred foreigners, accustomed to commanding deference and living in opulent comfort, suddenly found themselves prisoners inside their own luxurious quarter. Day by day, the psychological pressure increased. Charles Eliot, trapped alongside his countrymen, found himself caught between his duty to protect British lives and his obligation to safeguard British property. At last, in a fateful move, he broke the deadlock. He ordered the British merchants to turn over all their opium to Lin. In doing so, he made a crucial promise: the British government would reimburse them in full. With that assurance, Eliot transformed a dispute over illegal private merchandise into a matter of state. What had been a corporate risk was now a liability on the British nation's balance sheet. In effect, he had written a promissory note that only the Royal Navy could ultimately honor. Over the next 6 weeks, the surrender took place. Chest after heavy wooden chest was brought ashore and delivered into Chinese hands. The final count was staggering: 20,183 chests of opium, more than 1,000 tons of the drug, with a market value exceeding £2 million, an astronomical sum in that age. Lin Zexu had achieved a total victory. He now held the very poison that had been ravaging China. He could have locked it away, or more cynically, resold it. Instead, he chose to make his action into a grand, purifying spectacle. On the beach at Human, he ordered 3 immense pits dug and lined with stone and timber. Workers smashed open the chests and dumped the dark, resinous opium balls into the trenches. They then added lime and salt and flooded the pits with seawater, creating a swirling, foul-smelling slurry. For 23 days straight, under official supervision and the curious gaze of onlookers, laborers stirred this concoction before finally washing it out into the South China Sea. Lin had made his statement. He had stood firm against the foreign barbarians, seized their dangerous contraband, and ritually cleansed the shores of the Celestial Empire. He had defended both the law and the moral dignity of the throne. But in London, the same events were being reshaped into a very different story. The confinement of British nationals and the destruction of their property were framed as a grave insult to British honour and rights. The merchants Jardine, Matheson, and their peers hurried home to lobby Parliament with relentless energy. They did not describe themselves as traffickers in narcotics. They presented themselves as respectable businessmen whose goods had been unjustly confiscated by a despotic, backward government. The debate in Parliament was carefully steered away from the ethics of the opium trade, which were barely mentioned, and refocused on the high principles of free trade, the sanctity of property, and the need to teach the insolent Chinese a lesson. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, a man who viewed the globe as a chessboard for advancing British interests, pressed strongly for war. An expeditionary force was assembled, not to seek compromise, but to impose punishment. A fleet of warships and transports, loaded with 4,000 soldiers, set sail for the Chinese coastline. The sounds they would bring were not the clink of silver for tea, but the thunder of guns. The conflict that followed the First Opium War was no duel of equals. It was a collision between 2 different technological eras. The Qing Empire commanded a huge army, but it was an army of a pre-industrial age. Its infantry carried matchlock muskets, spears, and bows. Its navy was composed of wooden war junks, built for battling pirates in coastal waters, propelled by oars and sail. Its strategy relied heavily on fixed fortresses and the assumption that an enemy would attack predictable points along the coast. Britain, by contrast, brought the fruits of the Industrial Revolution to bear. Its soldiers carried percussion-cap muskets that could fire reliably even in damp weather. Its artillery outclassed Qing guns in both range and accuracy. But the most decisive British weapon was neither man nor cannon, but a machine, the steam-powered warship. The most notorious of these was a privately owned vessel chartered by the East India Company, a ship that would come to symbolize the entire war, the Nemesis. It was not large or graceful. It was a flat-bottomed, iron-hulled paddle steamer. Its shallow draft less than 2 meters allowed it to ignore coastal defenses and steam upstream into rivers, deep into the Chinese interior, far beyond the reach of any Qing war junk. Its iron hull made it practically immune to the solid shot fired from Chinese cannons. It could move against wind and current, showing up where it was least expected. It was, in effect, a floating artillery battery of unnerving mobility. The war began in earnest around mid-1840, not with one grand clash, but through a series of swift, devastating operations. The British squadron, commanded by Admiral George Eliot, cousin to Charles Eliot, bypassed the heavily fortified harbour of Canton entirely, to the utter confusion of Qing strategists. Britain's aim was not to seize a single port, but to paralyze the empire's vital arteries. They captured the island of Zhoushan, creating a strategic northern base. Then they picked apart the Pearl River Delta's defenses. The Bogue forts, which shielded the approach to Canton, were imposing stone bastions, but they pointed their guns out to sea. The Nemesis and other steamers simply glided past those gun emplacements, landed troops behind them, and captured them from the rear. The technology gap was like a gorge. In one engagement, a flotilla of 15 Chinese war junks bravely attacked a lone British steamer. Their cannonballs bounced uselessly off its iron plating, while the steamer's pivoting guns knocked them out one by one with explosive shells ordnance the Chinese had never before encountered. The war's most punishing phase began when the British targeted the economic lifeline of the Qing Empire, the Yangtze River. In the summer of 1842, a British armada of more than 70 ships, including several steam vessels, advanced up the Great River. This was a masterstroke. The Yangtze was the country's central commercial highway, and crucially, it intersected with the Grand Canal, China's internal grain transport system, which moved rice from the fertile south to Beijing in the north. By capturing the city of Zhenjiang at the confluence of the Grand Canal and the Yangtze, the British could effectively choke off the capital's food supply. The battle for Zhenjiang was among the war's bloodiest. The Manchu garrison, fully aware of the city's importance, fought with furious determination. Unlike other Qing forces that had sometimes broken under British firepower, the Manchu defenders in Zhenjiang resisted street by street and house by house. But heroism could not compensate for obsolete tactics and inferior arms. The British infantry, with disciplined volleys and superior guns, eventually gained the upper hand. Realizing that all was lost, the Manchu commander is said to have calmly returned to his headquarters, sat down in his chair, and ordered his attendants to set the building on fire, burning himself alive in an act of final defiance. The fall of Zhenjiang shattered the resolve of the Daoguang emperor. With his capital imperiled by starvation and the British fleet poised to sail on to Nanjing, the empire's ancient southern capital, he was left with no realistic option but to seek terms. The war, which had begun over confiscated opium on a distant beach, was drawing to a close. Gunboat diplomacy had overruled imperial decrees, and the curls of smoke from countless opium pipes were now joined by the dark plumes rising from Britain's coal-fired navy. The old order lay in ruins. A new, fundamentally unequal relationship was about to be written, not in ink alone, but in the bitter language of capitulation. The guns fell silent. The gunpowder haze over the Pearl River Delta began briefly to clear. Aboard the imposing British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored in the waters off Nanjing, a very different kind of confrontation was now at hand. It was August 29, 1842. The air hung hot and heavy, thick with the uneasy quiet that follows a storm. Inside the ship's grand cabin, British officers in crisp, sweat-stained uniforms stood with rigid self-assurance, some nearly bored in their confidence. Their leader, Sir Henry Pottinger, exuded the unhurried authority of a man holding an absolute advantage. A man there not to negotiate, but to dictate. Across the table sat the Qing imperial plenipotentiaries. Their silk robes sagged slightly in the oppressive heat. Men like Qi Ying and Yilibu were cultivated scholars, masters of calligraphy and Confucian doctrine, long accustomed to a world in which nuance and ritual carried decisive weight. Now they faced the stark arithmetic of military defeat. The document on the polished table between them was not a point of discussion, it was a bill. a bill for a war China had never wished to fight, detonated by a drug Britain had insisted on pushing. This was the Treaty of Nanjing. It was a masterpiece of imperial exaction, drafted not in the subtle brushstrokes of traditional diplomacy, but with the hard, straight lines of conquest. Each article was a precisely aimed humiliation. First, the indemnity. China was to pay a crushing sum of 21 million silver dollars, 6 million to compensate for the opium Lin Zexu had so zealously destroyed, 3 million to cover debts owed by Chinese merchants in Canton to their British counterparts, and a final colossal 12 million to reimburse Britain for the entire military campaign. In effect, China was being forced to underwrite the cost of its own invasion. This debt would burden the Qing treasury for years, a relentless outflow of silver from the empire's core. Then there was the matter of territory. A small, rocky, sparsely inhabited island off the southern coast was to be ceded to Britain in perpetuity. To British eyes, it was an ideal deep-water harbour, a strategic base, a warehouse and fortress for trade and naval power. To the emperor, it appeared to be a trifling, mostly barren outpost of fishermen. Its name was Hong Kong, a permanent foreign enclave carved into the flank of the Celestial Empire, a wound that would not close. Yet the most far-reaching element of the treaty was not the money or the island, but the dismantling of the centuries-old Canton system. For generations, the Qing court had confined foreign trade to a tightly regulated district in a single city, Canton, and dealt with foreigners only through a specially licensed guild of Chinese traders known as the Kohong. It was a form of quarantine. The Treaty of Nanjing blew that system apart. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were to be opened to British residents and commerce. This was not just an expansion of market access. It was a deliberate infusion of foreign influence into key coastal hubs. British merchants, missionaries, and officials could now live and own property in these treaty ports. To ensure these foreigners could operate without hindrance, the treaty established the principle of extraterritoriality. British subjects who broke the law in China would not be tried by Chinese courts, but by their own consular authorities under British law. The Son of Heaven was no longer the supreme legal power over everyone within his realm. The Qing state was being told, implicitly but unmistakably, that its justice system was unfit to govern Europeans. The Qing commissioners signed. Their hands shook, but they signed. What alternative did they have? British warships occupied their rivers, and their cannons could level Chinese cities at will. This document was the first in what would later be called the Unequal Treaties, a model that other Western powers would soon copy. It revealed to the world that the once feared ancient empire was vulnerable. The door had been forced open, and soon Americans, French, and others would push through, each demanding their own concessions, their own ports, their own exemptions. The ink on the Treaty of Nanjing was barely dry, yet it had already carved a deep scar into China's political and psychological landscape. It marked the formal beginning of what Chinese historians would later name the Century of Humiliation, a prolonged twilight of defeats and impositions from which China would not begin to emerge for 100 years. The peace it bought was thin and brittle, resting on resentment and wounded pride. It could not last. In the logic of empire, an open wound is seldom treated as something to be healed. More often, it is a point to be pressed. The so-called peace was, in reality, a lull pause for British merchants to tally their rising profits and for the Qing court to absorb the disorienting truth of its new weakness. Tellingly, the very commodity that had triggered the war, the opium itself, was not mentioned in the Treaty of Nanjing. It was a strategic omission. The British knew that openly demanding the right to traffic narcotics would be indecent and politically awkward. The Qing, weakened and desperate, were nevertheless unable to secure its prohibition. So the trade rolled on, and it grew. It now poured into the freshly opened treaty ports. Silver drained out of China at an intensified pace, corrupting bureaucrats, ensnaring millions in addiction, and eroding the nation's resilience. The mark left by Nanjing did not close, it festered. In Britain, some voices argued that the treaty's terms were still too modest. Imperial appetite is rarely sated. They wanted additional ports, unfettered access along the Yangtze River deep into China's interior, and a permanent diplomatic mission in Beijing itself. The idea of a Western envoy installed in the sacred imperial capital was, for the Qing, an unimaginable affront. To push these demands, a pretext was required. In the chaotic world of the Chinese littoral, such pretexts were not hard to manufacture. In October 1856, one appeared in the form of a small vessel called the Arrow. It was Chinese-owned, with a Chinese crew, and it had once held British registration in Hong Kong, which had expired. The ship was likely linked to piracy. Chinese officials boarded it in Canton and arrested several sailors. The British consul, the combative Harry Parkes, claimed that at the time of the boarding, the Arrow was flying the Union Jack, and that hauling down that flag and seizing the crew constituted a gross insult to the British Crown. The flag almost certainly was not flying, and the ship's British papers had lapsed. The details were irrelevant. An outrage had been staged, a grievance performed, and the gunboats began to stir. This time, Britain would not go to war alone. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, eager for colonial prestige of its own, saw an opening. Its justification was even flimsier: the execution of a French missionary, Auguste Chapdelaine, who had been proselytizing illegally deep inside Guangxi province, an area then already torn apart by the massive Taiping rebellion. That Chapdelaine had likely been killed by local militia rather than under any direct imperial order was a nuance conveniently ignored. Britain and France, eternal competitors, now forged a partnership of convenience. Their shared objective was brutally clear: march on Beijing and force from the Qing throne a final absolute submission. Thus began the Second Opium War. In many respects, it repeated the pattern of the first, but at a larger scale and with greater brutality. An Anglo-French force captured Canton and governed it for several years through a puppet administration. Their steam-powered gunboats and rifled muskets steadily pushed northward, brushing aside the Qing's brave but outdated banner armies. Chinese troops fought with desperate valor at the Taku forts defending the river approach to Tianjin and ultimately Beijing. They managed in 1859 to repel a British assault and even sink several ships. It was a rare, exhilarating victory, a fleeting moment of pride that only stiffened the invaders' resolve. A year later, in 1860, the Allied powers returned with a far larger force. They overwhelmed the Taku forts and advanced inland. The road to Beijing lay open. The Xianfeng Emperor and his court vacillated between resistance and negotiation, paralyzed by indecision. Amid this confusion, Chinese forces captured a British diplomatic mission that included Harry Parkes, the very man whose aggression had helped trigger the conflict and subjected several of them to torture. Some died. To Lord Elgin, the British commander and son of the same Lord Elgin, infamous for removing the Parthenon marbles from Athens, this violation of diplomatic norms was the final unforgivable line. It was, in European eyes, an act of barbarism calling for an exemplary reprisal. When the Anglo-French forces reached the outskirts of Beijing, they found their target, the Yuanming Yuan, the Gardens of Perfect Brightness, known in English as the Old Summer Palace. Situated just northwest of the city walls, it was not a single structure, but a sprawling imperial complex covering more than 300 hectares. It was a fantasy landscape of lakes, streams, and constructed hills, dotted with over 200 halls, pavilions, shrines, and libraries. For a century and a half, it had been the Qing emperor's favored retreat and, in many ways, the political heart of their dynasty. It housed an unrivaled trove of art and luxuries, silk tapestries, priceless porcelain, ancient jades, gold and silver artifacts, and a treasure-laden library containing unique texts and manuscripts, the distilled memory of a civilization. The palace grounds even contained a series of European-style buildings with elaborate Baroque fountains, designed by Jesuit architects for the Qianlong Emperor. The Yuanming Yuan was, in miniature, The empire's wealth, refinement, and cosmopolitan reach made visible. What followed was not conventional warfare. It was looting on an industrial scale. For 2 days, British and French soldiers ransacked the palace. They smashed cabinets with rifle butts, wrenched gemstones from thrones, and stuffed pockets and sacks with anything portable and valuable. Officers methodically selected the choicest artifacts to pack into crates bound for Europe as war trophies. One officer compared the atmosphere to some fever dream of greed. Soldiers dressing up in the empress's robes, hanging imperial pearls around their necks, drinking from the emperor's own cellars. It was delirious vandalism, but pillage was not enough. Lord Elgin wanted an indelible mark, a punishment that would echo inside the Forbidden City. He resolved to scar the dynasty's prestige in a way no treaty could. On October 18, 1860, 300 British troops marched into the Yuanming Yuan, carrying torches and combustible materials. They set the palace ablaze. For 3 days, the splendid wooden pavilions burned. Thick black smoke rolled skyward, dimming the daylight over Beijing to a sinister twilight. The searing heat cracked the European stone facades, and showers of ash and glowing cinders fell over the capital. The ashes of centuries of art, of irreplaceable volumes and paintings, were scattered on the wind. It was an act of cultural devastation, a calculated attempt to erase a symbol of imperial majesty. When the last embers died, little remained but charred beams and the scarred shells of the European palaces, standing like skeletons in a field of cinders. The Xianfeng emperor, who had already fled the capital, was broken in spirit. The Qing government had no option but to accept the humiliating convention of Peking. The terms were crushing. The opium trade, previously a legal grey zone, was now fully and formally legalized. More ports were opened, including cities far up the Yangtze, giving foreigners access to the very heartland of China. Christian missionaries were granted the right to operate freely. Massive new indemnities were imposed, and for the first time, permanent foreign legations were allowed inside Beijing. The war ended. Britain and France had extracted all they desired. But in prying open China by force, they had set its deepest symbols ablaze. The smoking ruins of the Summer Palace seared themselves into China's collective memory as a metaphor for absolute humiliation, a wound that would burn, quietly but intensely, for generations, and later help kindle the fires of revolution. While British cannon were battering Chinese fortifications and French soldiers were slipping imperial trinkets into their pockets, another flag had become a familiar sight on the waters of the Pearl River Delta: the Stars and Stripes. The Americans were there as well. They would later portray themselves as neutral observers of the Opium Wars, unwilling participants, perhaps even moderating voices. But the historical record is uncomfortably clear. The American role in the opium trade was not one of innocence. It was one of discreet, highly profitable engagement. They were not yet empire builders in the British style. They were something in many ways more recognizably modern, supreme opportunists of commerce. Opium was, to them, just one more item in a diversified global portfolio, no different in principle from ginseng, furs, or cotton. Ethical questions were left to the sermonizers at home. In Canton, the ledger ruled. America's connection with China went back to the earliest days of the Republic. The first American merchant ship to reach Canton, the Empress of China, arrived in 1784, barely a year after the Treaty of Paris had ended the Revolutionary War. The new nation was eager for trade, and China offered a golden chance. But the Americans confronted the same stubborn obstacle the British had: China's lack of interest in Western goods beyond silver. If they were to avoid draining their limited reserves of precious metal, they needed a product that Chinese buyers actually wanted. They found it not in Indian fields like the British, but in the Ottoman Empire's poppy-growing regions. American firms became leading smugglers of high-grade Turkish opium. This shadowy commerce was not conducted by pirates. It was overseen by some of the most prominent mercantile dynasties of New England families whose names would later adorn universities, museums, and hospitals. The origin of their wealth, in many cases, could be traced back to the poppy. Consider the Delano family of Massachusetts. Warren Delano Jr., maternal grandfather of future U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sailed to Canton in 1833. He eventually rose to become a senior partner in Russell & Company, the largest American trading house in China. Their business portfolio was diverse, but their most lucrative line was the clandestine import of opium. Delano was no street corner dealer. He was a pillar of the expatriate elite, a man of culture and high reputation. He professed no moral conflict in his work. Writing home, he insisted he regarded the trade as fair, honorable, and respectable, no more harmful, he claimed, than the commerce in wine and spirits back in the United States. Chinese laws against opium he dismissed as irrational hindrances to free trade. His returns were immense. He went home a wealthy man, and his opium-earned fortune helped underwrite generations of Delano influence. The Forbes family of Boston presents a similar story. John Murray Forbes, later a titan of American business and railroads, also began his career with Russell & Company, managing its clipper ships laden with opium from the ports of the Ottoman Empire to China. The speed of these American-built clippers, such as the famed Sea Witch, gave them a significant competitive edge, allowing them to deliver their illicit cargo more quickly than their rivals. Like Delano, Forbes leveraged his China trade profits into vast domestic enterprises, particularly in railways and finance. Time and reinvestment scrubbed away the trade's taint, leaving only a legacy of respectable philanthropy and influence. The Perkinses, the Cabots, the Lowes, the roster reads like a catalogue of New England's patrician clans. Many were deeply entwined with the opium business that was quietly shattering lives in distant Chinese villages and cities. The American operation was a logistical marvel. Traders purchased raw opium in ports like Smyrna, modern Izmir, in the Ottoman Empire. The sticky blocks were packed into chests and loaded onto swift clippers for the long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and through the Strait of Malacca into the South China Sea. They rarely brought the chests directly into Canton's harbor. Instead, they used aging ships moored offshore as floating warehouses, particularly near Linton Island. In these unofficial havens, beyond the immediate reach of Qing law, the Americans sold their opium to Chinese smugglers who arrived in nimble, heavily armed coastal craft, the same fast crabs and scrambling dragons that haunted the patrols. Payment was in silver, which the Americans then used to purchase tea, silk, and porcelain for sale back home. During the First Opium War, the United States stayed officially neutral, an extremely lucrative neutrality. While British merchants were distracted by conflict and the Royal Navy was tied up in battle, American traders eagerly captured their share of the market. They profited from the war without firing a shot. But history likes its ironies. The commerce Yankee merchants had so skillfully exploited abroad would eventually circle back on them. After the Opium Wars and the California Gold Rush, a wave of Chinese migrants crossed the Pacific, many finding work on the vast transcontinental railroads, the very railroads financed by men like John Murray Forbes. These migrants brought their culture, their cuisine, their labor, and the solace of the opium pipe. The vice that had been exported so profitably to China now slipped into the United States itself. In the intricate, crowded Chinatowns of San Francisco and other Pacific cities, opium dens appeared dark, hushed rooms heavy with the sweet, cloying smoke. Exhausted laborers, for a small fee, could stretch out on rough bunks, inhale a few pipes, and momentarily escape their grinding realities. For a time, white Americans viewed this as an exotic, contained Chinese problem. But gradually, as non-Chinese patrons found their way into these dens, opium use leaked into wider society, sparking fear, moral outrage, and ultimately the first American anti-drug laws. The Yankee traders, in the pursuit of profit, had unwittingly sown the seeds of their own country's future narcotics crisis. The dragon's breath had crossed the ocean. While the poppy was bleeding wealth into empires in the East, its more genteel spectre haunted the West, not in crowded dens, but in small, respectable glass bottles. It perched on mantelpieces in Victorian parlours between the family Bible and a daguerreotype of some stern ancestor. It nestled in the folds of a mother's handbag, lay in the waistcoat pocket of a member of Parliament, and lined the medicine cabinets of eminent physicians in London, Paris, and Boston. This apparition had a name: laudanum. For over a century, it was the angel within the bottle. The formula, perfected by the English physician Thomas Sydenham in the 17th century, sounded almost disarmingly simple. Opium dissolved in high-proof alcohol, often flavored with cinnamon, saffron, or other aromatics. A tincture, a liquid vessel for the poppy's power. What made laudanum so consequential was not its recipe, but its availability. It required no prescription. Anyone could buy it by the spoonful or by the bottle from the neighborhood chemist, the grocer, or a traveling peddler. It was cheaper than gin, more predictable than prayer. In the roaring furnaces of the Industrial Revolution, laudanum became the universal remedy, the sovereign cure for the aches, coughs, sleepless nights, and nameless anxieties of a world being torn up and rebuilt by iron, steam, and factory whistles. For the working-class mother in a Manchester slum, laudanum must have seemed almost miraculous. A few drops on a sugar cube would calm a shrieking, teething child long enough for her to snatch a few hours of sleep before the next brutal shift in the mill. Commercial preparations like Godfrey's cordial or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup became household fixtures, their advertisements promising peace to mother and child alike. In truth, they were largely opium in sugary disguise. A generation was being raised on opiates, fed their first taste of stillness not from warm arms and lullabies, but from dark, syrupy liquid. The resulting infant deaths, often recorded under vague diagnoses like failure to thrive, debilitation, or even accidental overlay, formed a silent catastrophe that remained largely unspoken. Yet the crisis was not confined to the poor. This was an epidemic of the respectable classes. In the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury and the salons off the Boulevard Saint-Germain, laudanum was the crutch of the finely tuned nervous system. Women labeled with chilling clinical vagueness as the weaker sex were especially vulnerable targets. Doctors diagnosed them with all-purpose conditions such as hysteria or neurasthenia, catch-all labels that could encompass anxiety, depression, insomnia, grief, and even the suffocating boredom of a constrained domestic existence. For such ills, the prescription was often laudanum. It smoothed ragged nerves, dulled the chronic pain of illness or pregnancy, and cast a soft golden haze over the rigid rules of polite society. The ideal Victorian wife calm, compliant, uncomplaining, was often maintained in that state by a constant low-level opiate fog. If corsets bound the body, laudanum laced the mind. The intellectual and artistic elite were equally enthralled. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, given opium for pain and rheumatism, slipped into a lifelong dependence. His visionary poem, Kubla Khan, with its lush, dreamlike imagery, was famously composed under the drug's influence. Thomas de Quincey's 1821 Confessions of an English Opium Eater transformed laudanum addiction into a gripping literary experience, a descent into vast, radiant dreamscapes and equally vast, suffocating nightmares. His book stripped away the purely medicinal veneer and exposed the psychological abyss that laudanum opened. It captured the imagination of the reading public and of other writers. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the Bronte sisters, Edgar Allan Poe, great minds across Britain and America turned to opium, often to cope with illness or creative pressure, and sometimes to chase its eerie intensification of thought and feeling. The angel in the bottle was also the muse and the tormentor of a generation's literature. The scale of this quiet dependency was immense. By the 1860s, it was estimated that England's Fens region, a damp, unhealthy landscape where ague and chronic pains were common, consumed more than half of all opium imported into the country. Per capita opiate use in Britain appears to have exceeded even China's at the height of that country's own crisis. Across the Atlantic, the picture was similar. Patent medicines with patriotic-sounding names like Black Drop, and McMunn's elixir were staples in American households. Their precise contents were secret, or rather unregulated, and many contained hefty doses of morphine or opium tincture. During the American Civil War, morphine, the primary active alkaloid of opium, first isolated in 1804, became indispensable. Surgeons administered it liberally to wounded soldiers. The pain relief seemed miraculous. But a new term eventually emerged, the soldier's disease, referring to the addiction that plagued many veterans after the war. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s sharpened the problem. Morphine could now be injected directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the stomach and liver for a faster, more potent effect. Doctors believed this method was somehow safer because it appeared cleaner and more scientific than swigging laudanum from a bottle. Instead, it produced a more efficient addict. By the close of the 19th century, the medical community began to perceive the grim pattern it had helped create. The placid, sherry-sipping laudanum user had given way to the restless morphine addict. The angel within the tincture had taken off its mask to reveal a demon. Physicians, alarmed, now sought a remedy for the very condition their own prescriptions had spread. The era seemed ripe for a technical fix, for a scientific answer to a scientific problem. The world was ready for a new miracle. In a pristine German laboratory, one was about to be born. The setting was Elberfeld, Germany. The year, 1897. The age pulsed with confidence in chemistry and industry, with a belief that human ingenuity could conquer any ailment. In the research facilities of Friedrich Bayer & Co., a burgeoning chemical and pharmaceutical enterprise, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann was at work. Hoffmann was diligent and methodical rather than flamboyant. One of his first successes was the synthesis of acetyl salicylic acid, a less irritating form of salicylic acid for his father's rheumatism. That compound would soon be marketed under a name the world still knows: aspirin. It was a monumental achievement, destined to soothe headaches and fevers for billions. But on Hoffmann's bench, another experiment unfolded in parallel, with far darker implications. Bayer's pharmacology chief, Heinrich Dreser, had set his sights on morphine. Morphine had long been the gold standard of analgesics, yet its addictive potential had become an alarming social stigma. Every major drug company was chasing an elusive prize, an opioid as powerful as morphine, but free from its devastating dependency. Bayer, in particular, hoped to develop a more effective cough suppressant. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and bronchitis were rampant. A strong, reliable medicine that could tame violent coughing fits promised immense profits. The reigning theory was simple and terribly wrong. If scientists could tweak the morphine molecule, they might strip away its addictive side effects while preserving its pain and cough-relieving powers. Hoffmann, under Dreser's direction, revisited a formula first produced by an English chemist, C.R. Alder Wright, in 1874. Wright had boiled morphine with acetic anhydride, creating a new compound, but his findings had gone nowhere. Hoffmann repeated and refined this process, chemically acetylating morphine to produce diacetyl morphine. Initial animal tests and informal trials on factory staff were astounding. Diacetyl morphine appeared to be an extraordinarily effective cough suppressant, far superior even to codeine. Test subjects also reported a powerful sense of comfort, contentment, and subtle euphoria. Dreser was jubilant. On thin and deeply flawed evidence, he concluded that diacetyl morphine was more effective than morphine and, critically, non-addictive. He even promoted it as a remedy for morphine addiction itself, a way to move patients off the older drug and then, supposedly, taper them down safely. The marketing department only needed a name. The compound made users feel strong, uplifted, heroic. Bayer christened it heroin, from the German word heroisch. In 1898, the company launched what would become one of the most disastrously successful marketing campaigns in medical history. Heroin was sold in vials and tablets, each labeled with the Bayer cross. Advertisements filled medical journals across Europe and North America. Free samples were shipped to doctors in bulk. along with glowing literature describing the drug's virtues. It was touted primarily as a cough suppressant, a treatment for bronchitis, asthma, and the seemingly unstoppable tuberculosis. But its uses were quickly expanded. It was recommended for pain from advanced cancers, for digestive disorders, even for mental illnesses like melancholia and schizophrenia. Above all, it was trumpeted as a safe, non-habit-forming alternative to morphine and a cure for morphine dependence itself. For a brief period, the world believed. Overburdened doctors, staring down the morphine crisis they had helped create, welcomed heroin as a godsend. They prescribed it widely, trusting the declarations of one of Europe's most respected chemical firms. Patients adored it. It worked. It calmed the cough, dulled the pain, and wrapped them in a warm, blissful ease. But within a few years, troubling patterns emerged. Physicians noticed that patients transferred from morphine to heroin to treat their addiction quickly developed an even more voracious craving. Their tolerance rocketed. They required larger and more frequent doses. When cut off from heroin, they suffered withdrawal far more brutal than anything they had experienced with morphine. The terrible truth of the chemistry gradually revealed itself. Those two added acetyl groups did not weaken morphine's effects, they amplified them. Diacetyl morphine was more fat-soluble than morphine, which allowed it to cross the blood-brain barrier with startling speed. Once inside the brain, enzymes stripped off the acetyl groups, converting it back into morphine, but now delivered in a concentrated, instantaneous flood right to the opioid receptors. Heroin was, in essence, a high-speed morphine delivery system. Far from being a cure, it was a Trojan horse. The heroic drug was simply morphine in a more seductive, more devastating form. By the early 1900s, the fantasy collapsed. Hospitals began to report waves of heroinism, as addiction to the drug was called. Patients whose prescriptions were stopped turned in growing numbers to illicit sources. The angel in the brown bottle had been replaced by the hero in a glass syringe. The supposed solution had turned into a curse more virulent than the problem it was meant to solve. Facing mounting criticism, Bayer quietly halted heroin production in 1913. It dropped the product from its catalogue, an attempt to walk away from the monster it had unleashed. But it was too late. The formula was simple, the profit irresistible, and the demand now global. The genie was not just out of the bottle, it had seeded itself in black markets across continents. The chemical offspring of the poppy laudanum, morphine, and now heroin were rampaging. The addiction crisis no longer belonged to any one region. It had become a worldwide plague, and slowly, grudgingly, governments began to see that the issue could not be controlled by any single country in isolation. The first real jolt of this awakening came from an unexpected direction. The United States, a young power only recently engaged in overseas empire building. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the US acquired the Philippines, and with them, a tangled inheritance. Under Spanish rule, the colonial government had run a state opium monopoly, licensing sales to the Chinese community and collecting the profits. To many American officials, steeped in Protestant moralism, government-sponsored drug dealing was repugnant. A key voice in this drama was Bishop Charles Henry Brent, an Episcopal missionary of intense moral conviction and considerable diplomatic tact. Sent to the Philippines in 1901, he quickly encountered the social wreckage caused by opium addiction among the Chinese and other local populations. He saw opium not as a private vice, but as a corrosive force undermining entire communities. Brent became a relentless advocate for reform, arguing that the United States had a moral duty not only to abolish the colonial opium system in the Philippines, but also to spearhead an international effort against the broader narcotics trade. His appeals resonated with President Theodore Roosevelt, a man keenly attuned to the political power of great moral crusades. Roosevelt and his advisors, notably the energetic physician diplomat Dr. Hamilton Wright, recognized another dimension as well. An anti-opium initiative could enhance America's global standing, win goodwill from a suffering China, and pressure European colonial rivals, especially Britain, with its massive Indian opium industry. Idealism and realpolitik aligned. The United States would champion a new cause: international drug control. The first step was fact-finding. In 1908, Roosevelt called for an international gathering. The following year, in the cold February of 1909, delegates from 13 nations with stakes in East Asian trade assembled in Shanghai. This Shanghai Opium Commission was not a treaty-making conference. It had no power to enforce decisions. It was, in essence, a grand joint inquiry. Its purpose was to openly assess the scale of the opium problem, share information, and lay the groundwork for future binding agreements. Tension crackled in the air. The American delegation, led by Bishop Brent, arrived with missionary zeal, seeking strong moral condemnations of the opium trade. The Chinese representatives, headed by the elder statesman Tang Shaoyi and others, made a heartfelt plea. They described their nation's long torment at opium's hands and outlined the Qing government's ambitious 10-year plan to eradicate domestic poppy cultivation. Across the table sat the British representatives, guardians of the world's largest official opium enterprise. They were prepared to concede that opium smoking, especially in Asian colonies, should be suppressed. But they staunchly defended the right to produce and export Indian opium for medicinal uses, a category broad and elastic enough to preserve much of their business. For 3 weeks, the delegates argued and debated. They presented statistics, haggled over terminology, and tried to distinguish between medical and non-medical use, between smoking and eating, between opium and its newer derivatives. Deep differences remained, but the Commission did accomplish something unprecedented. It acknowledged on an international stage that narcotics were a shared global problem. The Shanghai meeting closed with 9 non-binding resolutions. They urged governments to gradually suppress opium smoking, to tighten controls on morphine and other derivatives, and, most importantly, to meet again under a stronger mandate to draft a genuine international treaty. Shanghai did not solve the crisis, but it placed it irrevocably on the world agenda. The momentum carried forward to The Hague in the Netherlands. After long diplomatic maneuvering, a new and more ambitious conference convened there. The Hague International Opium Convention of 1912 brought together representatives of many more nations, this time with the explicit goal of crafting the world's first multilateral drug control agreement. Again, the central fault line ran between the prohibitionist fervor of the Americans and Chinese and the economic caution of the old commercial powers, Britain, the Netherlands, Portugal, Germany, whose colonial economies and pharmaceutical industries were deeply entangled with opium and its chemical cousins. After protracted negotiations, the delegates signed the convention on January 23, 1912. It was far from perfect, but it laid down crucial principles. The convention called on signatory states to regulate the production and distribution of raw opium, to suppress the manufacture and use of prepared opium for smoking, and to bring under control not only opium itself, but its derivatives, morphine, cocaine, another colonial commodity of concern, and heroin. These substances were to be manufactured and traded solely for medical and legitimate purposes. This was a watershed. For the first time, the international community declared that narcotics were not ordinary commercial items, but special, dangerous substances requiring collective oversight. Yet the agreement had weaknesses. It required ratification, and many nations dragged their feet. It established no powerful international authority with enforcement teeth. Germany, home to major pharmaceutical producers, stalled until it could be sure its industrial interests would not be unduly harmed. Other empires were likewise cautious. And then, just as this fragile machinery of cooperation began to turn, the world ripped itself apart. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 set off the chain reaction that became the First World War. The spirit of international collaboration that had animated The Hague evaporated under the pressures of total war. Nations that had sat together as partners in 1912 were, by 1914, striving to annihilate one another. The opium poppy, as ever, adapted to chaos. Morphine was needed on a massive scale to ease the suffering of millions of wounded soldiers, ensuring not a reduction but an expansion of global opiate use. The first serious attempt to awaken and regulate the empire of the poppy had been deferred, drowned out by artillery fire. The legal framework existed, the core principles were introduced, but the long global campaign against drugs had barely begun. The great colonial empires that had once managed the flow of opium with bureaucratic precision were fading into ghosts. Flags came down, new ones went up. Borders were redrawn, constitutions drafted, independence declared. But the withdrawal of imperial power created something more than patriotic ceremonies. It created vacuums. Those vacuums opened in many of the very regions where the poppy grew most readily. Into those spaces stepped men with rifles, men with ambition, and men who understood a brutal truth. Wherever the poppy would grow, money, influence, and weapons could follow. One of the most consequential of these spaces was not a single country, but a tangled knot of mountains and frontiers, veiled in mist and scattered villages, where Burma, Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos meet. On maps, it was a blur of ridges, rivers, and disputed lines. To cartographers, it was a problem. To smugglers, it was a gift. The world would come to know it by a name that fused geography and profit: the Golden Triangle. Before the Second World War, this remote region produced opium mostly on a modest local scale. Hill peoples, the Wa, the Shan, the Lahu, and others, cultivated it as one crop among many, using it as medicine, for ritual, and as a small source of trade income. Some flowed north into China, some west into India, but the volumes were limited. History, however, had other plans. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in the Chinese Civil War. The nationalist Kuomintang, KMT government fled to Taiwan, but not all of its soldiers made it to the island. A sizable force from the 93rd Division refused to surrender and retreated south instead out of Yunnan, across the border and into Burma's Shan state. Thousands of battle-hardened men, still organized, still armed, but now without a state. To the newly independent Burmese government, they were a nightmare. Foreign soldiers entrenched in a rugged, barely governed highland, impossible to evict with the weak forces available. But to another distant power, they looked useful. In Washington, the Cold War was taking firm shape. The fall of China, always envisioned in Western capitals, primarily as the loss of its mainland, felt like a strategic disaster. American officials increasingly subscribed to the domino theory, that if one nation after another succumbed to communism, the whole region might follow. The CIA, still young and aggressively improvisational, was tasked with countering this advance by any means short of open war. The stranded KMT troops in Burma looked like a ready-made proxy army, a dagger poised at the southern flank of communist China. Under a covert initiative often referred to as Operation Paper, the CIA began quietly arming and supporting these KMT remnants. Weapons, ammunition, and advisors were flown in from Thailand on clandestine flights. The aim was to build them into a force capable of launching raids into Yunnan, sowing chaos, and perhaps one day helping to reclaim the mainland. But feeding and equipping an army, even a ghost army, is expensive. Ammunition might arrive free of charge from Langley's budget, but food, uniforms, and pay did not. The CIA's money was limited. The KMT commanders needed a revenue stream. All around them, in the cool uplands and terraced valleys of Shan State, a familiar plant thrived. The hill tribes had long grown opium. The KMT officers, no strangers to hard necessities, recognized the obvious solution. They were not, at least in their own eyes, crime bosses. They were counter-revolutionaries, exiles, patriots, pressed by circumstance to exploit the only major cash crop at hand. They consolidated what had been scattered, small-scale production, into something much more organized. They imposed a tax on local farmers, payable in raw opium. They built and protected primitive laboratories where the sticky resin was cooked down into morphine base and later refined into high-grade No. 4 heroin. a pale, almost white powder ideal for smoking or injection. Most critically, they took control of transportation. They organized large mule caravans, hundreds of animals at a time, snaking along mountain paths under the guard of armed escorts. These down-country caravans carried the opium and later morphine and heroin southward through jungle and over ridge toward the Thai border. Across that border, corrupt officers in the Thai military and police fellow anti-communists, and therefore natural CIA partners, provided either direct protection or deliberate blindness. Bribes were paid, deals struck. The Golden Triangle's heroin flowed out to ports like Bangkok, then onward to Hong Kong, Saigon, and beyond. The Golden Triangle was less an ancient tradition than a modern invention, a narco region created at the intersection of Cold War strategy, decolonization, and geography. Its foundations were laid not only with poppy seeds, but with CIA money and KMT desperation. Militarily, the project failed. The nationalist incursions into China were quickly crushed. Strategically, the dream of using this lost army to roll back communism proved hopeless. But economically, the experiment was spectacularly successful. By the late 1950s, the Golden Triangle had eclipsed China as Asia's main source of illicit opium. Then the Vietnam War turned an already dangerous situation into an inferno. As American involvement deepened and spread into neighboring Laos, Washington again turned to covert warfare. In Laos, the CIA mounted what later became known as the Secret War, backing the Royal Lao government and Hmong guerrillas against the communist Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces. To sustain this hidden conflict, the CIA assembled its own airline, Air America. Its aircraft C-47s, C-123s, Pilatus Porters and others flew into short jungle airstrips, bringing guns, ammunition, radios and rice to remote anti-communist fighters. On the return journey, these planes often had unused cargo space, and in a world of corrupt warlords and fragile alliances, empty space is a temptation. Local commanders quickly recognized that the most valuable outbound cargo they had was opium. Poppies were cultivated widely among the Hmong and other mountain groups, partly for their own use, partly as a commodity. The CIA needed their loyalty badly. Destroying their main source of income would drive them toward the communists, so an informal accommodation emerged. The agency looked the other way as Air America aircraft, or planes chartered alongside them, carried opium from the highlands to hubs controlled by Allied warlords and military intelligence. From there, the supply fed directly into the expanding heroin industry in the Golden Triangle. KMT-linked organizations, Burmese generals, Thai officers, and Chinese syndicates refined and exported it. Guns and money moved one way, opium and heroin moved the other. Ideology and profit became indivisible. The logic was brutally straightforward. To fight communism, you needed allies. To hold those allies, you tolerated their business, and their business was the poppy. Amid this swirling chaos, new local powers rose. None cast a longer shadow than a man named Chiang Chi-fu, better known by his nom de guerre, Kun Sa. Of mixed Chinese and Shan ancestry, Kun Sa grew into a master manipulator of the region's fractured politics. He raised his own militia later styled the Shan United Army, supposedly dedicated to Shan independence. In practice, he was constructing a formidable drug empire. Kun Sa fought the KMT where their routes overlapped. He clashed with the Burmese army when it suited him and occasionally collaborated with them when it did not. He cultivated ties with Thai officers and Chinese traffickers. To his soldiers and some Shan villagers, he presented himself as a nationalist patriarch. To the outside world, he was a crime lord with his own private army and fortified domain. By the 1970s and 1980s, Kun Sa reputedly controlled as much as 60–70% of the heroin leaving the Golden Triangle. He built a de facto capital at Ban Hin Taik, and later in the remote base of Homong, near the Thai-Burmese frontier. There he constructed schools and clinics and ringed his refineries with anti-aircraft weapons. He occasionally courted the press. receiving Western journalists in jungle camps and claiming he was compelled into the heroin trade to fund his people's struggle. In a gesture equal parts publicity stunt and blackmail, he once proposed to sell his entire annual opium crop directly to the US government at a fixed price, arguing this would be the most efficient method of keeping it off American streets. Washington politely declined. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, as US troop deployments in Vietnam peaked, the Triangle's heroin began to follow them. Highly refined number 4 heroin, often 90% pure or more, flooded Saigon. GIs could buy it for the price of a few beers. Many, already traumatized, injured, or numbed by war, turned to it. Addiction rates among American forces in Vietnam soared. The covert operations that had helped nurture the Golden Triangle's heroin economy now came back to haunt the very army fighting in the region. The drug was effectively disabling soldiers sent to combat communism, financed by anti-communist allies and indirectly facilitated by the intelligence networks supporting those allies. The system had become self-consuming, the dragon devouring its own tail. The Golden Triangle reigned as the capital of the illegal opium trade for decades. But no kingdom in this story lasts forever. As the 1970s and 1980s wore on, external pressure mounted. The Thai government, pushed by the United States and alarmed by its own internal drug problems, mounted serious operations to close trafficking routes and to encourage alternative crops. The Burmese military, for its own reasons, launched offensives against both KMT remnants and Shan insurgents, including Khun Sa. Production did not cease, but it grew more dangerous, more costly, more scattered. And as one door began to swing shut in Southeast Asia, another, far to the west, opened wide. The poppy is nothing if not adaptable. It waits for fertile soil, for farmers with few alternatives, and for a measure of insecurity and weak central authority. It found all three in abundance in Afghanistan. For centuries, Afghanistan had played a bit part in the global opium market, a producer for local and regional demand. Never a central source, rugged terrain, poor infrastructure, and chronic political instability limited large-scale development. But by the late 20th century, those very traits would become part of its advantage. The crucial turning point again came with foreign invasion. On December 24, 1979, Soviet tanks rumbled across the Amu Darya River into Afghanistan. The Kremlin intended to prop up a faltering, friendly communist regime in Kabul. They expected a limited operation. Instead, they plunged into a grinding 10-year war against a fierce, religiously inspired resistance, the Mujahideen. In Washington, this was perceived as an opportunity for payback after Vietnam, a chance to bog down the USSR in its own unwinnable quagmire. The US, working closely with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, launched Operation Cyclone, one of the CIA's largest covert undertakings. Billions of dollars in arms, training, and support flowed to Afghan guerrilla groups, though never directly. Almost all assistance was channeled through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, which decided which factions to favor. These fighters, like the KMT remnants and the Hmong before them, needed more than rifles. They required food, medicine, transportation, salaries. The CIA provided weaponry. It did not provide a full economy. Once more, the poppy stepped into the role. The conditions in Afghanistan were ideal. Previous development programs, especially in the Helmand Valley under the Afghan monarchy and Western aid, had built irrigation systems and roads. The civil war that erupted after the communist coup and Soviet intervention shattered official markets, but did not destroy this agricultural base. Farmers who once grew wheat or orchard crops saw their commercial outlets vanish. Opium, by contrast, did not need refrigeration or large storage facilities. It was lightweight, valuable, and durable. Traders, often linked to local commanders, came directly to the villages with cash in hand. The structure that had emerged in the Golden Triangle now repeated itself on a grander scale. Mujahideen leaders encouraged poppy cultivation, taxed production and transport, and protected smugglers who moved opium into neighboring Pakistan and Iran. In the Pakistani tribal areas, labs processed it into morphine base and heroin under the loose oversight and sometimes direct participation of elements within the ISI and local warlords. The same roads, passes, and clandestine airstrips that brought in American-supplied arms often carried out narcotics. The Khyber Pass once again became a two-way artery, weapons and money one way, heroin the other. Karachi and other ports handled the outbound flow toward the Middle East, Europe and beyond. The scale of change was staggering. In the late 1970s, Afghanistan's opium production was estimated in the low hundreds of tons per year. By the end of the 1980s, as the Soviets withdrew, those figures had multiplied several times. The country had become the single largest supplier of illicit opium in the world. The Golden Triangle remained important, but Afghanistan was rapidly becoming what commentators would later call the Saudi Arabia of opium. The Soviets left in 1989. The communist regime in Kabul fell a few years later. But peace did not come. The Mujahideen factions, flushed with victory and arms, but divided by ideology, ethnicity, and personal rivalries, turned on one another. A brutal civil war reduced much of Kabul to ruins and splintered the country into warlord fiefdoms. For these strongmen, the poppy was the only reliable revenue stream. It financed militias, bought loyalty, and kept guns supplied. Out of this chaos emerged a new force, the Taliban. Drawn largely from young men educated in austere religious schools, the madrasas of Pakistan and southern Afghanistan, they promised to end warlordism and impose strict Islamic order. By 1996, they controlled Kabul and most of the country. The Taliban's stance toward the poppy was complex and deeply pragmatic. In Islamic law, intoxicants are generally forbidden, and the movement's clerics regarded opium as haram. But absolute doctrinal purity is a luxury rarely afforded in war. The Taliban inherited a state dependent on opium exports and faced the ongoing costs of governance and conflict. So they taxed it. They institutionalized the usher, a 10% levy applied to the opium harvest. They charged tolls on trafficking routes and duties on exports. They discouraged domestic heroin consumption, seeing addiction among Afghans as a moral and strategic threat, yet tolerated and profited mightily from production for foreign markets. By the late 1990s, Taliban-controlled Afghanistan was producing the vast majority of the world's illicit opium. It was a unique creature, a theocratic regime doubling as the central node of a global narcotics industry. Then, in 2000, an extraordinary development. Seeking international recognition and economic aid, and perhaps responding to internal religious pressure, Mullah Mohammed Omar, the Taliban's reclusive supreme leader, issued a sweeping decree banning poppy cultivation throughout Afghanistan. Unlike in many countries, the Taliban had both the ideological will and the coercive apparatus to enforce this ban, and enforce it they did. Using a mix of religious authority and brutal punishment, they slashed poppy fields across their territory. The impact was visible from satellites. In a single growing season, Afghan opium production collapsed by more than 90%. The United Nations verified the results with some astonishment. In purely statistical terms, it was the most dramatic anti-narcotic success in history. Global heroin markets trembled, prices spiked, traffickers scrambled to secure leftover stockpiles or find alternative sources. But this unique interlude was brief. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda hosted and protected by the Taliban attacked the United States. Weeks later, American and Allied forces invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban regime was toppled by a combination of Northern Alliance ground troops and devastating Western air power. In the power vacuum that followed, many of the same warlords who had grown rich on opium in the 1980s and early 1990s reclaimed territory, this time as allies of the US and NATO. Under their watch, and under the uneasy gaze of foreign soldiers, the poppy came roaring back. Western governments now faced the same impossible calculus that had haunted previous interventions. Destroy the crop and you destroy the livelihoods of countless farmers, driving them into the insurgents' arms. Ignore it, and you fund corruption and war. Attempts at crop substitution were small, slow, and inadequate in the face of the poppy's simple, brutal economic logic. Meanwhile, the Taliban regrouped as an insurgency. Quickly recognizing the opportunity, they returned to the opium business, now from the other side of the conflict. They taxed farmers in areas under their influence, protected traffickers from government raids, and collected tolls on shipments. Opium became one of their primary funding sources. The upshot was grotesque. The longest war in American history was, to a substantial degree, financed by the same drug that was simultaneously tearing through Western societies back home. The poppy fields of Helmand and Kandahar paid for IEDs and rifles. The heroin they generated fed habits in Moscow, Tehran, London, and the American Midwest. As the 21st century advanced, this great river of Afghan opium flowed outward along reconfigured versions of ancient paths. The Balkan route through Iran and Turkey into Europe, the northern route through Central Asia into Russia, and eastward along modern Silk Roads toward China. Enormous sums changed hands. Cartels, militias, corrupt officials, and insurgents all dipped into the stream. Yet as immense as this plant-based trade was, it was about to be joined and partly superseded by a new, homegrown crisis in the richest country on earth. This next wave did not begin in remote fields, but in air-conditioned corporate offices and brightly lit doctors' clinics. It would take the poppy's ancient promise relief from pain and repackage it in a modern, reassuring guise. The prescription bottle. The stage for this new catastrophe was the United States, and the catalyst was a company called Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family. For decades, strong opioids such as morphine and oxycodone had been used sparingly in medicine, mainly for acute post-surgical pain or the agony of late-stage cancer. Physicians understood, from long experience and plenty of grim evidence, that these drugs could be fiercely addictive. The Sacklers, with their background in aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, saw a vast untapped market. The millions of people suffering from chronic non-cancer pain back injuries, arthritis, work-related strain, sports injuries. If they could persuade doctors that opioids were safe enough for long-term use in these cases, the profit potential was enormous. In 1996, Purdue introduced its flagship product, OxyContin, a sustained-release formulation of pure oxycodone. The key selling point was its time-release mechanism, which, the company claimed, would deliver steady pain relief over 12 hours while minimizing spikes that might lead to euphoria and addiction. Purdue's marketing blitz was relentless and sophisticated. The company sponsored thousands of pain management conferences, paid prominent physicians as speakers and consultants, and flooded medical journals, conferences, and mailboxes with promotional materials. Sales representatives assured doctors that, thanks to its special formulation, the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. At the same time, professional organizations, often supported by pharmaceutical funding, pushed a new paradigm: pain as the fifth vital sign. Patients were to be asked routinely to rate their pain on numerical scales, and doctors were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to treat that pain as aggressively as they would high blood pressure or fever. The campaign worked spectacularly. Doctors, reassured by Purdue's claims and backed by seemingly authoritative educational materials, began prescribing OxyContin not just for end-stage cancer, but for chronic back pain, dental surgery, minor injuries, and more. Many genuinely believed they were acting compassionately and in accordance with modern best practice. Prescriptions skyrocketed. Purdue and the Sackler family reaped billions. These were not underworld profits. They were recorded in corporate reports, taxed, invested, and poured into philanthropy. For countless patients, the story began innocently. A manual laborer with a back injury, a teenager with a sports-related knee surgery, a middle-aged office worker with chronic neck pain. Their physician, acting within the new norms, wrote a prescription. The pills came in an amber bottle, with dosage instructions and the pharmacy's reassuring label. But the less than 1% addiction figure, frequently cited by Purdue, was not grounded in robust evidence. It traced back to a short letter published in a medical journal in 1980, describing a low rate of addiction in hospitalized patients briefly given opioids under close supervision. This narrow observation was grotesquely misapplied to the very different scenario of long-term, outpatient use. Patients swallowed their pills as directed. Many discovered that OxyContin not only dulled their physical pain, but lifted their mood, softened emotional distress, and made daily life feel more manageable. Over time, their bodies adapted, tolerance developed. They needed higher doses to achieve the same effect, or simply to avoid feeling unwell. When some tried to taper off, they experienced withdrawal, chills, vomiting, bone-deep aches, anxiety, insomnia, and a sense of physical and mental torment that was often worse than the original pain. Their brains had been rewired. Dependency, carefully engineered by chemistry and marketing, took hold. Others quickly learned that the supposed safety of the time-release mechanism could be thwarted. By crushing, chewing, or dissolving the tablets, they could override the 12-hour dosing cycle and experience a sharp, heroin-like rush. On the street, these pills became prized for their potency. People who might never have sought out illicit drugs found themselves addicted to a pharmaceutical product akin in strength and effect to high-quality heroin. As overdose deaths mounted in the late 1990s and 2000s, pressure built. Journalists, whistleblowers, and some doctors began exposing Purdue's misleading claims. Lawsuits were filed. State and federal authorities moved to regulate prescribing more tightly. Prescription drug monitoring programs were established. Physicians, fearing legal scrutiny or loss of their licenses, started cutting back dosages or abruptly stopping patients' opioid prescriptions. But by then, a vast population was already dependent. Many were not stereotypical drug users. They were miners, truck drivers, suburban parents, elderly patients, all bound by a biochemical tether to strong opioids. When their legal supply was curtailed, they were thrown into the full horror of withdrawal. Pain returned, magnified by their altered tolerance. Desperation followed. On the streets, another product awaited them: heroin. And thanks to the steady production in Afghanistan and efficient trafficking networks, heroin was often cheaper and easier to obtain than diverted prescription pills. The two arcs, the old world of the poppy fields and the new world of pill mills and pain clinics, collided. A person who had started with a doctor's careful handwriting on a prescription pad now found themselves meeting a dealer in a parking lot, buying a bag of powder. They learned to cook it in a spoon and inject it, or to snort it, or to smoke it. Many told themselves they would do it just this once, until their next refill. Many kept going. Heroin addiction in the United States changed character. Previously associated largely with marginalized urban populations, it now spread into suburbs, small towns, and rural counties, especially in regions already laid low by economic decline and unemployment. Rust Belt communities, Appalachian hollows, Midwestern farming towns, places where chronic pain, physical labor, and lack of opportunity intersected. The Afghan farmer tapping his poppies under an unforgiving sun, the cartel chemist in a clandestine lab, the middleman moving heroin across borders, and the laid-off factory worker in Ohio or West Virginia. They were now bound together in a single sprawling chain of cause and effect. And even as public awareness caught up with the heroin wave, another transformation was underway. Heroin itself was being displaced by something still more dangerous and insidious: synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Fentanyl, first synthesized by Janssen Pharmaceutica in 1960, is an extremely powerful opioid, about 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. It was originally used in anesthesia and for severe pain, especially in cancer patients. But in the 21st century, illicit labs, initially many in China, later increasingly in Mexico, began manufacturing non-pharmaceutical fentanyl and related analogs. For traffickers, fentanyl was a dream product. It required no fields or farmers. It could be produced year-round in small concealed facilities using precursor chemicals that were, for a time, loosely regulated. Its staggering potency meant that tiny amounts measured in milligrams or even micrograms could replace far larger weights of heroin. It was cheaper to smuggle, more profitable to sell. Dealers began mixing fentanyl into heroin supplies to increase strength or stretch product, often without informing buyers. Others pressed it into pills, made to look like familiar medications, Xanax, OxyContin, or other popular tablets. A dose roughly equivalent to a few grains of salt could be lethal. Users, unaware of the concentration, overdosed in alarming numbers. Overdose deaths in the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe surged into the tens of thousands per year. Naloxone, an opioid antagonist, became more widely distributed, saving countless lives, but the wave showed no sign of fully receding. Each clampdown on one supply route seemed to produce a new variation, a new synthetic molecule, a new trafficking pipeline. And so, after 5 millennia, the story circles back to its essential tension. The poppy and now its chemical heirs still offer what humans have always sought: relief from pain, escape from fear, a soft curtain to draw across the harsh glare of existence. We have pursued that promise with ingenuity and ferocity. We have built empires on it, ruined dynasties over it, and waged both open wars and covert ones in its shadow. We have dissolved the plant's essence in wine, in alcohol, in tinctures. We have crystallized it into powders, stuffed it into capsules, compressed it into tablets, and concentrated it into micrograms of synthetic fire. Each time we believe we have mastered it, made it safer, more scientific, more controllable, we discover only a new angle on the same ancient danger. Today, the legacy of the poppy is woven into a dense global tapestry of relief and ruin. It is the Afghan cultivator, trapped between warlords, the Taliban, foreign troops, and drought, for whom the flower is the difference between hunger and survival. It is the pharmaceutical executive, whose spreadsheets and sales targets translated into millions of prescriptions. It is the grandmother on maintenance therapy, the young adult lost to an overdose, and the parent who finds a child unresponsive on a bedroom floor. For about 5,000 years, we have tried to harness this simple flower. We have tried to separate its gift blissful oblivion, the silencing of pain, from its curse. Again and again, we have failed or succeeded only briefly. The poppy continues its unhurried harvest, year after year, in fields and factories and clandestine labs. And we are still counting the cost. For about 5,000 years, we have sought to harness the power of this ordinary flower, to capture its promise of warm oblivion and merciful forgetfulness. We have raised it in our gardens and in our empires. We have carved its image into stone and cast its chemistry into patent formulas. We have declared it sacred, condemned it as evil, taxed it, banned it, monopolized it, smuggled it, and medicalized it. We have turned it into incense for ritual, medicine for pain, inspiration for poets, a weapon of commerce, an instrument of policy, and finally into invisible micrograms of lab-made dust scattered across the globe. We have convinced ourselves again and again that this time will be different, that this new form, this new policy, this new technology will finally let us keep the gift and discard the curse. Yet we have never truly mastered it. Each attempt to lock it safely inside our systems has only shifted where the damage falls, and who pays the price. After all this time, all this history, all these wars and treaties and quiet personal tragedies, the poppy continues its calm, patient harvest out in the fields, in the factories, in the chemistry sets of clandestine labs. And we are still counting the dead, still tending the wounded, still arguing over laws and ethics and blame, still chasing the same fragile hope that someday we might finally learn how to live with this flower's power without being consumed by it.